San Francisco, and this is Bloomberg Technology. Coming up in the next hour, Google is making a big retail push, this time into China. What its $500 million investment in JD.com means for the e-commerce landscape. Plus, chip manufacturers and tariffs, how the Trump administration's actions against China could cost the U.S. semiconductor industry. And a Cold War is brewing in space, and President Trump just upped the ante. Details on his vision for a new sixth branch of the U.S. military, the Space Force. But first, to our top story, Google just made a big play in the race for a slice of the global e-commerce pie, this time by dropping over $500 million in cash into Chinese online retailer JD.com. The two companies plan to explore retail solutions throughout Southeast Asia, the United States, and Europe, as Google seems to be preparing for a long-term defense strategy against Amazon, which is not so quietly encroaching on Google's digital ad space. The move also offers Google the ability to partner with a company that has its own fulfillment and logistics network, just like, you guessed it, Amazon. This comes just a week after Google entered into a deal with French retail giant Carrefour to sell groceries online in France. Here to tell us more, we've got Bloomberg's Mark Bergen, who covers all things Alphabet for us. And in New York, we have Isaac Stonefish, Senior Fellow at the Asia Society. So, Mark, first of all, how does this fit into the broader e-commerce strategy at Google?
Yeah, Google's certainly taking a shift. Years before, they had their own shopping delivery service called Google Express. That's largely been a failure. Their new strategy has been the partner, and it's sort of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and their enemy in this case is Amazon. And this also fits with their strategy around Asia and China in particular, which is to partner with a lot of Chinese companies that are looking to expand outside of China.
Well, it's interesting given that Amazon doesn't have a great China strategy.
Yeah, I think the markets they're focusing on right now are Southeast Asia. Indonesia is a big market that JD is looking at, and Google as well. They're looking at other countries in Southeast Asia, and clearly India is a big focus. Google has talked a lot about their efforts, and we've seen them kind of chip away at returning to mainland China, and they recently cut a partnership with Tencent and now with JD.
Isaac, what's your take on this? JD.com, the number 2 player when it comes to e-commerce in China, second to Alibaba.
So I think this move is very important, mostly on symbolic levels. The $550 million price is roughly less than 1% of the company's worth. And I think really what it is Google trying to say to Beijing, listen, we want to come back into China. We want to be doing business with Chinese companies. And they picked a relatively non-sensitive company to do it. E-commerce is much easier to get into. It's much less of an information business than, say, search engine, which is what caused Google all of its problems in China in the first place.
So, Mark, I was in China, in Beijing, when Google left the country. And, there's been no sign of a potential return. Could this be more about being back in the good graces of the Chinese government than it is about actually building a global e-commerce strategy?
I think that there are signs of return. We saw earlier this year, Google opened up the Beijing AI Center. They've really been pushing AI, their TensorFlow AI kit in China with Chinese developers. I think they've been trying to back in with their cloud service. Now with the e-commerce, this has been a much more, I would say, around their strategy in China, which is to go to these Chinese companies and these startups and larger companies like JD and say, we want to help you expand outside and effectively take on bigger rivals like Amazon.
Isaac, Google has never been willing to censor its search results, which was basically the requirement of operating the search engine in the country. Is that something that you think could change, or is this about getting in the country but not having a search engine there?
I hope not. In 2010, when Google decided to leave China, China's economy was roughly a third the size that it is today, and China just becomes more and more inevitable for global tech companies. And I really hope that Google, unlike, say, LinkedIn, which does censor its Chinese language site, keeps to its ethics and keeps with the don't be evil vibe.
Mark, talk to us about how this fits in with the digital assistant strategy. Of course, Amazon has Alexa, Google has Google Home, and it has seen some pretty early success.
Yeah, and I'd say Google's a very different company than it was in 2010 in some ways. They're certainly looking a lot with search towards voice and AI, and that's where they see a bigger challenge from Amazon. Right? Amazon Echoes have taken off, and that cuts to the core of Google's business. It's not an immediate threat to their business is still growing significantly, but they're looking ahead, and possibly you might see them return to in Asia and in China in particular with a voice service. And then the part of that network that they're looking at is we're going to use our partners like Walmart and Target here, and maybe like JD in parts of Asia, to actually have a voice commerce strategy so people can buy on using these voice assistants.
Different enough to censor its search results?
Yeah, TBD, I guess.
Isaac, talk to us a little bit about, if this is about taking on Amazon in the future, and we know that Amazon's ad business is encroaching on Google, encroaching on Facebook, Amazon, hasn't had great success in China and has really been boxed out by, the local heavyweights.
They certainly have. I think it's kind of interesting to watch American companies scramble to work in China just as Chinese companies are scrambling to work in the United States. And I think Bloomberg audiences, some of them know what JD.com is, but your average American consumer has absolutely no idea about JD or even Alibaba. So I think we're probably going to see more of these partnerships in the future where major American and Chinese tech firms realize that in order to get into the other market, they need to partner with a local. That said, we saw Friday the announcement of those $50 billion of tariffs on Chinese goods. We saw retaliatory tariffs from Beijing, and it's certainly possible that worsening political tensions between the United States and China means that this is a rare piece of good news in U.S.-China tech trade.
That's interesting, Mark. There certainly is a political angle here as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think in there are markets like Indonesia, Philippines that probably don't have as much name recognition with JD.com as they do with Amazon and Alibaba, and so JD comes in, and Google has this global brand recognition. So it benefits JD, and then it also benefits Google if and when they return to China.
Talk about the longer-term benefit of the ad business here and how Amazon is, slowly encroaching on Google's territory.
Yeah, what Amazon have is, is basically what the ad business calls a closed loop, right? They have everything from people go in and they perform their search queries on Amazon, and then they buy things on Amazon. They have their credit card information. They have Amazon knows everything about the shoppers. Google knows a fair amount, but they don't necessarily know when people complete a purchase. And so with these partnerships with JD and Walmart, what Google can have through their partners now is they can actually tie the ad dollars that these major brands spend with Google, they're the core of their business, to an actual purchase. And that's really effective when they're going up against the challenge. I mean, we should put these things in perspective here. Amazon is building out an ads business, but it's still very, very, very small compared to the share that Google has.
And what about the cloud? I mean, there's also a long-term benefit of cloud sales.
Totally, and I think that's where Google's seeing a lot of their future growth right now. Outside of ads, it's in cloud, it's in hardware. The cloud is something Diane Greene has talked pretty openly about how she sees China as a really exciting opportunity. And I think if we do see Google go back into China, it's likely in some sort of offering around cloud and AI.
But China, of course, Isaac, is not without its cloud competitors. Alibaba has a huge cloud business. Amazon has an aspiring cloud business in China. And also the cloud, I presume, comes with its own set of security concerns that the Chinese government might raise its eyebrows at. Do you think Google can build a big cloud business in China?
I think it could if it decides to. I think the worry is what it would have to give up in terms of data security and in terms of brand equity in the United States to do so. I think a lot of worries about American tech companies partnering with Chinese tech companies or being too involved with China is that they basically always have to store their servers in China. There's not that same reliability of data security as there would be in the United States. So Google could certainly be a lot larger in China if it so chose. But the question is, what would it have to give up to do so?
Isaac Stonefish of the Asia Society, thank you so much for joining us. Bloomberg's Mark Bergen, you're going to be back here talking about another story later in the show. Well, Alibaba's Jack Ma says Malaysia inspires him. The company opened an office in Kuala Lumpur and will launch a special week to promote Malaysian products and services. The event will be held next month and will highlight over 50 Malaysian brands across Alibaba platforms. Ma and Prime Minister Mahathir Mohamad have also agreed to use Alibaba's technology to help young people across the country. Ma says he's confident Malaysia will continue to welcome foreign investment. Coming up, the microprocessor. Could President Trump's tariff on Chinese goods inadvertently hurt America's chip-making companies? We're going to find out next. And if you like Bloomberg News, check us out on the radio. Listen on the Bloomberg Radio app, Bloomberg.com, and in the U.S. on SiriusXM. This is Bloomberg. semiconductor. It is the heart of your smartphone, laptop, server farm, and more. And those precious chips could be hit hard in the latest wave of tariffs being levied by the Trump administration against China. Starting July 6th, the White House will impose the first of 2 sets of tariffs on up to $50 billion worth of imported Chinese goods. The catch, U.S. chip makers could wind up being taxed on their own processors that are designed here, but manufactured in China. What does this mean for the chip industry? To answer that, I'd like to welcome in Romit Shah on the phone, Managing Director and Senior Analyst at Nomura Instinet, and with us here in the studio, Bloomberg Tech's Ian King, who covers chips. So, Ian, walk us through exactly how this will all work and who it will affect.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a big deal. This is a $400 billion industry. Companies like Intel, Qualcomm, NVIDIA, all of the household names from the US chip industry, which kind of dominate the list of top 10 companies worldwide. What they generally do is either manufacture here or have their chips outsourced manufactured in Asia. Then those chips then go to China, where they get what's called packaged. So they get a stamp on them saying made in China, but really they're made in the US, or they're made in Korea, or they're made in Taiwan. They're packaged in China. So then they come back out of China or get installed in phones or computers in China for import into this country and elsewhere.
So, Romit, do you think this could have a negative effect on U.S. companies?
I actually don't believe most of the U.S. semi companies will suffer from products coming back from China. Intel and Texas Instruments are really the only 2 companies that assemble and test their products in China. They also happen to have assembly and test manufacturing in other locations as well, like Taiwan and Israel. So I think these 2 companies stand out, but they have the ability to move production to other locations if this thing with the U.S. and China goes through.
Ian, would you agree?
I think the bigger issue, if I could just say one last thing, is that if the U.S. restricts U.S. semiconductor companies from selling components to Chinese manufacturers like we saw with ZTE, that would be a bigger issue, because China is obviously a very large market for these companies.
So 2 points there. Ian, one, do you agree this won't impact or hurt China,
yeah, I mean,
U.S.
I
companies?
think Romit made a very good point in the second point that he made, which is China is the biggest market for semiconductors worldwide. It's the biggest market for smartphones, biggest market for computers. Intel, Texas, doesn't matter who you are worldwide, you need access to that Chinese market. If this situation escalates further, if the Trump administration decides to escalate and China responds, market access becomes an issue. That could have a significant effect.
So, Romit, at this point, is the chip industry now more of a bargaining chip?
No, I mean, I look at... Yeah, that's funny. Look, China needs U.S. semiconductors, and the U.S. government knows it. China consumed almost $150 billion in semiconductors last year, and of that, they only produced about 10 to 20 billion. So they had a trade deficit last year of $130 billion in semiconductors, most of which is U.S. related. And this is a country that has a 2025 plan to be a leader in 5G, in artificial intelligence, and autonomous driving. And there's no way that they can do that without Intel CPUs, NVIDIA GPUs, and deposition tools from companies like Applied Materials. So I think that China will ultimately have to work with the U.S. to reach an agreement. And this uncertainty we're facing here is probably temporary. I think in the short term, you do have an industry that is seeing very strong fundamentals across almost every end market: data center, PCs, wireless. All those markets are strong or are poised to rebound in the second half of the year. And so we're still fairly optimistic on several companies in the space.
So, Ian, we've talked about the fact that these tariffs don't necessarily impact consumer products directly per se, but will this impact consumer prices?
I mean, we'll have to see how this plays out, because as Romit just has explained, you've got 2 sides with a lot at stake here. And I think quite unusually, the US is in a relatively strong position. China needs what the US is offering it. where that actually plays out, whether these component prices go up, it's more likely that the actual market prices of DRAM, of NAND flash, are going to affect your consumer prices rather than tariffs, at least for the short term.
Roman, how will this impact the Chinese chip industry? I mean, they obviously have their own ambitions and could turn this into an opportunity.
It's easier said than done. I mean, they don't have this. This is why, they had this massive trade deficit last year, and it's because they lack manufacturing capacity. They do not have IP for some important technologies, as Ian referred to, DRAM and NAND. And they don't even have the wafers. I mean, they're paying 10, 20, 30% premium prices just to get access to the wafers. So I think for all these reasons, China's in a difficult spot here.
So Ian, are China's goals when it comes to the chip industry, are they unrealistic?
Whether they're unrealistic or not remains to be seen. This will clearly act as an incentive to accelerate them, but it's hard, right? Everybody thinks of, oh, it's a factory. How hard can it be to make a factory? Well, the answer is these are the most complicated pieces of industrial equipment in the world. I mean, it's incredibly difficult. China has been trying to do this for a while. It's been able to buy the constituent parts. It's got PhDs, coming out of the wazoo in terms of the ability to do this. But it's difficult. There are very few companies in the world that can make chips, right, on the leading edge. Intel, Samsung, Taiwan Semiconductor, basically the three companies that dominate on the leading edge. China really, really needs to do this, has been trying really hard. No shortage of money, but it's difficult.
All right, Ian King, Bloomberg Tech, who covers chips, Romit Shah, Nomura Instinet. Thank you both. Well, the overseer of central bank says that Bitcoin may never be ready for prime time. The bank for International Settlement says that cryptocurrencies are too unstable and subject to too much manipulation and fraud to serve as bona fide mediums of exchange. It called their decentralized nature a fundamental flaw rather than a key strength. Coming up, former Tesla workers may be chilled from speaking up on worker safety concerns due to a confidential severance agreement. We're going to bring you all the details next. And Bloomberg Tech is live streaming on Twitter. You can check us out at Technology, and be sure to follow our global breaking news network at TikTok, on Twitter. This is Bloomberg. Just last week, Tesla announced it would dismiss more than 3,000 employees, or about 9% of the company's workforce. The move underscored what many on Wall Street have been saying for months, that Tesla has reached a pivotal moment. After misjudging how quickly the car maker would be able to mass manufacture an electric car for the first time, Musk is pumping the brakes from hiring at breakneck speed. Now, one of the biggest issues for those who were fired from Tesla is the language being used in a confidential severance agreement. The company is likely to deter dismissed employees from going public with worker safety concerns, according to employment law experts. Here, with more detail on the potential severance agreement, Bloomberg's Josh Idelson. So what do we know about what Tesla is asking workers to sign?
So we've reviewed an agreement which includes provisions like requiring the employee to say that they had the opportunity to raise any safety or whistleblower issues and they were satisfied with how those were dealt with, to not disclose what the company calls business-related or confidential information, to assist the company in defending against claims from people, to not bring claims, to have any disputes about this agreement resolved in individual arbitration.
So are these more extreme than other companies would ask fired employees to sign?
So some experts, including a professor who used to write agreements like this, said this is not dramatically different from what you might see elsewhere. Other experts said some of this particular language really could have a serious chilling effect, even if it's language you might see somewhere else. That someone who has already signed something saying I had the chance to bring this stuff up and I was happy with how you dealt with it, is going to be hesitant to, in the future, say, oh, actually, there was this concerning thing that I saw there.
Does it make one think there are safety issues?
Certainly to critics, this is yet another sign that Tesla employees or former employees, if they could speak freely, would have a lot to say that the company might not like.
And yet, Dana Hull just wrote a story, our Dana Hull just wrote a story where some of these fired workers are still out there praising Elon Musk.
That's right.
So is there a smoking gun?
Well, you've seen a number of people come forward and say, even though I was fired, I believe in the company, and I think what they are doing is headed in the right direction. You have other people who work there now or have worked there who've said to me, to Dana, to others, that while they really believe in the company's mission, they have a lot of concerns about how people get treated along the way.
So what is Tesla saying about this?
So what Tesla said about this is that they have that language in there because they want to know if somebody had an issue, and on their way out the door, if they didn't raise something, this language is an opportunity for them.
So bigger picture, what does this tell us about Musk's own sort of, as we said, hitting the brakes on his big vision?
Well, we've seen just this weekend again in tweets that Musk has a sense that he's being treated unfairly and that people are out to get him and out to get the company, and that there are vultures, so to speak, whether it's the UAW or other auto companies or reporters that have some kind of conflict that are coming after the company. And there is a lot of concern from Musk within the company about what people are saying about Tesla.
And yet shares are still surging.
That's right.
So investors don't seem too upset.
I'm sure some investors would say this correction in terms of removing some people. I mean, Musk says you can criticize us, that we misjudged how many people we need and what we need them doing, that this is a positive step for some investors.
So what are the other things that you are going to be watching for? I know we're continuing to try to pull back the layers, find and see if there's something more that we need to know about going on.
Well, we have at this point inspections that have been opened by OSHA, multiple inspections the same month there. Last week I covered the trial that the National Labor Relations Board has opened. That's a proceeding that's going to go on for months.
You were there for 4 days.
That's right. We had just the beginning of a process in which the government prosecutors are presenting witnesses who say, for example, that managers tried to prevent people from leafleting to coworkers, prevent them from wearing union T-shirts. There was a point at which an employee said people were able to wear drug paraphernalia T-shirts on the factory floor, but were told that they had to stop wearing union T-shirts. Tesla said that this was an infomercial presented to attack the company.
Josh Adelson, Bloomberg News. Thank you so much for keeping us honest.
Thank you.
Coming up, we will catch up with Affirm CEO Max Levchin to talk all things fintech and more. That is next. This is Bloomberg. This is Bloomberg Technology. I'm Emily Chang in San Francisco. In early April, CB Insights published its quarterly report on global investment in fintech, and the authors made a bullish prediction. They expect global fintech investment to hit a new high in 2018. This week, CB Insights is hosting financial executives, tech giants, and blockchain experts in New York at the CB Insights Future of Fintech conference. One heavyweight in attendance, Affirm CEO Max Levchin, who of course co-founded PayPal and is now trying to build what he calls the first modern bank for a younger demographic, starting with point-of-sale loans. He joins us now from New York, along with Bloomberg Tech's Selena Wang. Max, thank you as always for joining us. So, progress report. You've raised $1.5 to $2 billion. You've raised at a $1.5 to $2 billion valuation, and you've made a promise that Affirm is going to be something big. What makes you think that Affirm can be a giant in consumer financing next to traditional and non-traditional players, given what you've seen over the last few years?
I think there are a couple of secular trends that really create an amazing opportunity, and the time is now. The biggest one is the new generation is mobile first, completely plugged in, and differentiates very much on the notion of transparency and simplicity. Young people today want to bank, want to deal with financial products that are honest, that tell them exactly what the costs will be, and that have no gotchas. And it's very hard for the traditional players where the business models are fundamentally built on some of these hidden fees and unfair advantages to speak to that audience. And I think that that's where the opportunity of fintech really is.
So you've launched a whole set, sorry, Selena, a whole set of campaigns. There's a new summer travel campaign, for example, where you're learning different ways that consumers want to pay. What are some trends that you're seeing there that are changing the way you do business?
Well, I think I already said a little bit to the point of simplicity, transparency really resonates with this audience. It's very hard to overstate just how powerful that notion is. Another sort of a similar trend, but maybe a little bit different, is the sense of self-budgeting, self-control, being able to look at your overall expense planning and say, I'm going to travel, I expect to go shopping, I expect to maybe do some interesting experiences, and I want to understand all these things together in a single picture. And we're working very hard to address that. But I think this notion of I want guardrails against overspending, against getting into debt, against carrying something that sticks with me all the way through the beginning of the school year for especially young people is a very powerful idea.
Now, a few years ago, you said you wanted to build the modern bank for the young demographic. You've started with point-of-sale loans, from physical products to experiences, but what's next?
I try very hard not to comment on the next feature. I think there's so much we can do just at the point of sale. We've traditionally spent most of our cycles online. We've now just started in 2017 offering Affirm offline in a brick and mortar, and it's gone amazing because in part of the elimination of the embarrassment of applying for credit and getting rejected. And so that's a huge area of opportunity and expansion for us, part of why all the fundraising that you've talked about. After that, there's just a endless opportunity as far as I'm concerned, and a lot of it comes from the fact that these products are the same for the last 50 years, and there's so much more we can do.
Now, part of the allure of Affirm is that after the financial crisis, a lot of millennials sort of lost faith in these traditional financial institutions. But now we're seeing firms like Goldman Sachs have some pretty good early success with their digital loan products. So does that mean the perception is changing here?
I think Goldman Sachs is kind of a really interesting outlier. They traditionally were not in the consumer-facing financial products, and after they turned bank during the crisis, they've now decided to step in and to take advantage of the license they got. I think it remains to be seen. I think there's plenty of entrants and some exiters from in this market. Reality is, U.S. credit card debt alone is on the order of $1 trillion. I think the opportunity is fundamentally with those who are trying to innovate as opposed to those of us that are sort of eyeing each other. I think a lot of the traditional banks are really married to the business model that unfortunately calls for deriving half your profitability from things like late fees, which I think is ultimately unsustainable.
Max, where are you today on Bitcoin and cryptocurrency? We just had another big institution, the Bank for International Settlements, saying it'll never be ready for prime time. You have people like Warren Buffett saying it's rat poison squared. What does Max Levchin think?
So I think the comparison that people draw with cryptocurrencies and the internet is sort of, if you look at the 90s, the internet was difficult and not user-friendly, and we're still finding out, in the 90s we're still finding out exactly how it would work, and today, look, we can't do without it. I think there's something to that comparison, but I think it's probably one step even earlier. The applications for cryptocurrencies haven't yet been developed. Cryptocurrencies as they exist today are the building blocks, not of the web, but of the underlying internet. It's literally the communications protocols. And so I'm very bullish, very long term. I am staying out of the speculation because I try very hard to bet on things that are meaningful as opposed to up and down all day long. And in the medium term, it'll take some brilliant product people as opposed to brilliant speculators to come up with what it's good for. So I remain neutral, as I have been in quite some time, but I love the technology behind it.
So do you own any? If so, what?
So I used to say no, I don't. Except one of my employees pointed out to me that a long time ago I accidentally invested in a company that paid a dividend in Bitcoin. So it turns out I do. But it certainly damages my claim of neutrality. But I promise you, I didn't even know about it, and it's not a lot.
Now, it's been in talks and reported that you've been in talks with Walmart to offer installment loans to their customers. So what can you tell us about that potential opportunity?
Sadly, I can't say very much about speculative relationships with retailers, no matter how small or large. Part of not overpromising.
Now, you have partnered with a lot of luxury stores as well, even though we were just discussing Walmart. And one of the criticisms is that Affirm makes it easy, almost too easy, for people to buy things that maybe they don't actually need, and even if they can technically afford it, maybe they shouldn't buy it. What's your response to that?
So the position we've always taken from the very, very beginning of Affirm, now almost 7 years ago, is we have to be very non-judgmental and extremely prescriptive. Non-judgmental means if you're buying shoes and that's the thing you have to have and you want us to finance it, if you can't afford it, we will. And if you're buying diapers or something essential and you cannot afford it, we do not want to be a party to that financial transaction because we feel we're pushing you into debt that you cannot afford. And so this notion of we cannot know what's important to you and what's right and what's wrong for your personal decisions, but if it's financially wrong for you, we will very much proscribe the transaction no matter how badly you want it. And that served us really well, especially because our business model has no fees of any kind, no late fees, no hidden fees certainly. As a result, we only make money when the consumers pay us back on time. Our incentives are completely aligned, and so when we don't believe they can or they would, we have to decline the loan. And I feel that that really has kept us honest through the years.
Now, you're in the business of giving people loans, which means you're collecting a lot of sensitive information about consumers. I'm sure you've been following the Facebook data privacy scandals. You have folks like Brian Acton, the co-founder of WhatsApp, saying it's time to delete Facebook. Elon Musk deleting his Facebook page, as well as the pages of Tesla and SpaceX. Which camp are you in?
I haven't deleted any Facebook pages of mine, if that's the question, but I think consumer data ownership and consumer privacy is essential, and I think it's essential squared for financial institutions, and we've always had that point of view from the very, very beginning. So it's no new sort of no behavior change for us because we were always over-indexing on safety, data ownership, minimum data extraction where we can so that we don't possess anything we don't require to underwrite. But I think it's essential, and I think one of the things that has really changed is a lot of these scandals, stories, whatever you want to call them, have really brought attention to just how much data Silicon Valley companies, technology companies have access to. And it's something that is probably healthy for the industry to sort of look at itself and say, well, are we doing enough? Can we do more? Should we do more?
But did Facebook make a mistake by not policing itself and being too generous with its data, you know, not just about how it uses its own data, but that the data that it gives to developers?
Kind of experiment that can only be run once. I don't know if it's possible to figure out what could have been. I think that they're now very actively stepping out and saying, look, we are going to take this seriously. We are taking this very seriously. I think the entire Silicon Valley is going to experience a massive scrutiny from not just the press and the regulators, but the consumers themselves, basically asking the question, you know, we've always been telling people, hey, this is a techno-utopia. Trust us, we're great. I don't think people are going to take it for granted anymore. And as a result, I think it's essential to get in front of these stories and issues and tell people, here's exactly what we're doing with your data. Here's what we're going to do going forward.
All right. Affirm CEO Max Levchin and our very own Selena Wang, thank you both. Coming up, former Theranos CEO Elizabeth Holmes has been charged with criminal fraud, and legal experts say she could face significant prison time. We're going to get the full picture next. This is Bloomberg. Theranos founder Elizabeth Holmes was criminally charged last week with defrauding investors. Holmes once briefly reigned as the world's youngest female self-made billionaire, and now alongside the company's former president, Sunny Balwani, she faces multiple fraud charges and significant jail time. Joining us now with the very latest, our Bloomberg tech reporter, Olivia Zaleski in New York. So, Olivia, tell us exactly how this happened, what she's facing.
So on Thursday, the U.S. Attorney's Office dropped a pretty thick criminal charge on Elizabeth Holmes, who is now the former CEO of Theranos, the blood testing company, as you know. As well, they also dropped it on the president of the company, Sunny Balwani. Now, this is pretty interesting because the criminal indictment is pretty much a carbon copy of the charges that came down in March on Holmes and Balwani for wire fraud, from the Securities and Exchange Commission.
What kind of jail time could we be talking about here?
It's pretty significant. So our legal reporter, Joel Rosenblatt, was telling me earlier this morning that really there's no getting out of this one for Holmes and Balwani. They could do a plea deal or they could fight this. In both instances, they will likely be facing jail time. There's sort of an ironclad indictment here. And I'm told that it could really be up to 20 to 24 years.
So, we had John Carreyrou on the show recently, author of the new book, Bad Blood, and that big Wall Street Journal investigation that, toppled the first domino that led to this. Take a listen to what he had to say about her motivation and whether there really was malice there.
She overpromised every step of the way, and it got to a point where the promises and the reality, the gap between them was so enormous that it became a massive fraud. Now, why did employees not blow the whistle earlier? Theranos had a culture of fear, intimidation, and secrecy. Elizabeth's boyfriend was the number 2 of the company, Sunny Balwani. He was the enforcer of that culture. He was constantly firing people, and it was very clear that Theranos was litigious. Elizabeth had sued early employees.
Olivia, we're talking about blood tests where, 1 million people got or could have gotten false results. What do we know more about the motivation that, led her to do this?
Yeah, it's having John Carreyrou on. He went into detail about this. In Silicon Valley, there is a culture here of really pushing the limits and sort of over-promising. The ends justify the means. Fake it till you make it attitude, and that really works when you have a new phone or a new app. But you can't really mess around with blood testing. And in this instance, the U.S. Attorney's Office just said, no way, we're not going to let you get away with that. So I think that's really what happened here, is that she thought she could do it, and then she kept pushing, and it just wasn't happening. And ultimately, the U.S. Attorney's Office is now charging her with a massive fraud.
We should mention that Holmes and Balwani were in a relationship together, for a time. During this sequence of events, what are they saying in response?
So we understand at this point that Holmes has settled with the SEC, which means that she did not deny or admit the charges that came down from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Balwani is continuing to fight the SEC charges. It remains to be seen what happens with the criminal charges. It's most likely that they will enter into some sort of plea agreement, but we really won't know that probably until the fall.
So how quickly could we expect things here to proceed?
It's going to take some time. I think in the fall things will really start, we'll be hearing more for what's happening here. We do know that she stepped down as the chief executive officer of the company, and the company is now really being run by their legal counsel.
So what is Theranos at this point? I saw the same headlines about Holmes stepping down, and it's curious, what is Theranos today? What was she CEO of?
Well, I think they have a lot of legal work to do, so the company sort of exists to help with that. I'm sure that they have all sorts of pending lawsuits from people who receive these blood tests that want to pursue legal action further against the company.
All right, Olivia Zaleski, Bloomberg Tech. I know you'll keep us posted. Thanks so much. Still ahead, President Trump's space aspirations take off. He's calling for robotic explorers on the moon as soon as next year. That story is next. This is Bloomberg.
45% of the S&P 500 members, MACDs, are
President Trump wants to create a U.S. Space Force. He announced this new military branch at a Space Council event at the White House Monday.
I'm hereby directing the Department of Defense and Pentagon to immediately begin the process necessary to establish a Space Force as the sixth branch of the armed forces.
Now, the president says this branch would be separate from the Air Force, but equal in stature, and he signed a space policy directive, which aims to make it easier for commercial companies to operate in space. Other goals: to send robotic explorers to the moon as early as next year, and another human lunar landing within 10 years. Chad Anderson is the CEO of Space Angels and joined us now. He's invested millions of dollars in private capital into new commercial space ventures and attended the meeting with the president. So, Chad, what exactly would a U.S. Space Force do?
Hi, Emily. So I don't think that many people know. This announcement was not expected, and I don't think that a lot of people have details as to what exactly this would mean. Like you said, he said that it would be on par, equal to the Air Force, but I don't think we have many details on that. But what he did say today, he said a lot of things this morning, but one of the remarks was that they are 1,000% behind budding space businesses, which from our perspective was the interesting bit, and the resounding sense from the room and all of the speakers in the room about leveraging innovation from the private sector.
So the president said he'd originally coined the term Space Force as a joke, and some in the military community have been rather lukewarm on this idea in general, but is this something that the United States needs? I mean, I know that there's concern about our competitiveness in space, but in general, do we need a sixth branch of the U.S. military in space?
I think the idea here is to show the dedication and the emphasis on space. Do we need it? I don't know. The Air Force is doing a lot to manage space for the military at the moment, and they're doing an exceptional job of that. So, you know, the conversation right now, from our perspective, we're really focused on the private businesses and the new startups and the entrepreneurial ventures that are innovating in space. And so the conversation is really about the military aspects of space versus the private interests in space, and how does that fall. And so putting a lot of emphasis on the military side of things definitely shifts the balance a little bit in that direction. But it was good to hear, again, the resounding, sort of wave of support for private ventures throughout the rest of the meeting.
So one of the concerns is space traffic control and the clutter and debris in space collisions. Talk to us about how big a problem that is.
Well, it's a growing concern. It's not much of an issue now. It's more about thinking about how far we've come in the last number of years. We've gone from satellite operators having a satellite or two, maybe a dozen on the larger end, to now companies like Planet having hundreds of satellites in orbit at the same time. And we've done that over a relatively short period of time. And looking forward, we have mega constellations like OneWeb. SpaceX is planning to launch 4,000 plus. So we have tens of thousands of satellites that are being, that are in the works, that are being planned to start launching in the next few years. And so the idea is thinking about it, getting ahead of the issue, recognizing that there's a lot of debris, and figuring out a way to keep our highways, so to speak, in space clear and safe to operate commercially.
Now, I know you're excited about the president's broad support of space initiatives. Sending people and robots to the moon, should that be one of the top priorities?
That was a key talking point throughout really the entire Space Council meeting today. And and there was astronauts and industry and scientists and professors, people from all walks really talking about this issue. And the long-term goal is to get humans to Mars. The conversation was really about, is the moon the best way to do that? And I think that was the general consensus of the room. Jim Bridenstine is the new NASA administrator, and this was his first Space Council meeting. And that was a key message that he was looking to get across, was that using robots and human exploration on the moon is a key stepping stone to getting to Mars. And we heard from a few different astronauts speaking about exactly that, how the exploration program today should mirror the exploration program of Apollo that started with Mercury and Gemini and culminated in Apollo, and thinking about how we've had the ISS, and this is a way for us to demonstrate that we can live and work in space for long periods of time. Now getting down to the lunar surface is a great way to test the technology that we will need for Mars on a different surface, and then the Mars mission being the ultimate sort of today's Apollo.
So quickly, Chad, what do you imagine Elon Musk is thinking right now?
Well, they were represented in the room, and I think that they were probably pretty happy to hear, again, the resounding support, the interest from the government at all levels, the interest from the Commerce Department and their increasing role here. I mean, the business of space is really top of mind.
Chad Anderson, CEO of Space Angels, back from that meeting with President Trump. Thank you so much. And that does it for this edition of Bloomberg Technology. We will be back tomorrow.